Blood pooled beneath the tiny creature's broken wing. Ember's hands trembled as she knelt beside the phoenix chick, its once brilliant feathers now dulled to ash gray. Yet even as terror clawed at her chest, what if her magic killed instead of healed? She couldn't turn away, not when those golden eyes pleaded for help. "Easy, little one," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that sang through the ancient oaks surrounding her forest sanctuary. Next, she closed her eyes and reached deep within herself, searching for that familiar wellspring of elemental power that had been both blessing and curse since childhood. Fire magic sparked to life in her palms, controlled, careful, warm, instead of destructive. From there, she guided the healing flame along the chick's injured wing, watching torn sinew knit together and broken bones mend. Soon after, the phoenix's feathers shimmered back to their natural crimson and gold. What followed was the most beautiful sound she'd heard in months, a soft, melodic trill of gratitude. Still, Ember held her breath as the newly healed creature tested its wing. Yet when it took flight, circling her head once in farewell before disappearing into the canopy above, she finally allowed herself to smile. "You're getting better at this," she murmured to herself, flexing fingers that no longer trembled. Even so, the familiar fear lingered. Despite that small success, she knew how quickly her power could turn deadly. On the other hand, moments like these reminded her why she'd chosen this isolated existence. More importantly, the forest accepted her magic in ways the supernatural world never had. In fact, here among the singing streams and whispering leaves, she could practice without fear of judgment or accidental harm. Not only that, but the woodland creatures seemed to understand her need for gentle healing rather than destruction. What's worse was how the outside world viewed elemental magic: wild, unpredictable, dangerous. To make things worse, most supernatural beings feared what they couldn't control, and her abilities had always been more tempest than tranquil brook. Moments later, as she rose from her knees and brushed dirt from her worn leather pants, something shifted in the forest around her. By the time she fully processed the change, the winds had carried a new scent, one that made her stomach clench with foreboding. Eventually, she recognized what had her wolf-like senses on high alert. Magic was dying somewhere beyond her sanctuary, bleeding into the air like spilled blood. That night brought disturbing dreams filled with cracking crystal and desperate silver eyes. Come morning, she would discover that her peaceful isolation was about to end forever. But then again, perhaps it already had. Instead of the usual peaceful silence that followed her healing work, rather, an ominous energy pulsed through the air like a dying heartbeat. Meanwhile, her own elemental magic began to respond to something vast and hungry, something that called to her power with magnetic intensity. At the same time, she felt the first stirrings of visions that would haunt her sleep, images of a massive throne split down its center and a man with storm-gray eyes reaching across an impossible distance. Because of that growing connection, her carefully controlled life was about to spiral into chaos. As a result, when twilight fell and the visions began in earnest, she was already preparing for the inevitable. So she gathered her meager supplies and secured her cottage, though she didn't yet understand why. That's why, hours later, when supernatural envoys appeared at her forest's edge, Ember felt destiny closing around her like a trap, which meant her time in hiding was finally over, whether she was ready or not. The throne cracked with the sound of breaking worlds. Ember jolted awake from her meditation, the vision's echoes still burning behind her eyelids. Next, she pressed trembling fingers to her temples, fighting to banish images that felt more real than her own memories. From there, she attempted to rationalize what she'd seen: a massive crystal throne splitting down its center, while supernatural beings collapsed around it, their life forces draining away like water through broken glass. Soon after the initial shock faded, she found herself pacing the length of her small cottage, unable to shake the apocalyptic scenes that had torn through her consciousness. What followed was a growing certainty that these weren't nightmares, but glimpses of a catastrophe already unfolding beyond her forest sanctuary. Still, She tried to convince herself otherwise. Yet the images clung to her mind with terrifying clarity. Entire forests withering to dust, magical barriers collapsing, and through it all, the desperate face of a man she'd never met but somehow recognized. Even so, it was his silver eyes that haunted her most. Despite never having seen him before, she could recall every detail with photographic precision. The exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes, the way his dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and most disturbing of all, the way he'd reached for her across whatever distance separated them. On the other hand, something about his desperation called to her elemental magic in ways she didn't understand. More importantly, in the vision, her fire had answered his call without the usual fear or resistance that plagued her daily existence. In fact, she could still feel the echo of that connection humming beneath her skin like electricity. Not only that, but every instinct screamed that this wasn't her imagination. Somewhere in the supernatural realm, someone was dying, and he needed her help specifically. What's worse, her uncontrolled response to the visions was becoming dangerous. To make things worse, when another wave of images crashed over her, the man's lips moving in what looked like a desperate prayer, her magic surged and split her wooden table in half. Moments later, scorch marks decorated her walls and ceiling, testament to how completely her careful control had shattered. By the time she managed to rein in her power, her hands were shaking and her cottage looked like a battleground. Eventually, exhaustion forced her to sink onto her bed, but sleep brought no respite. That night, the visions intensified, showing her the same scenes over and over with growing urgency. Come morning, she'd witnessed the crystal throne crack dozens of times, each fissure spreading wider than the last. But then, as dawnlight filtered through her windows, the final vision arrived with devastating clarity. Instead of the usual destruction, she saw the man more clearly than ever before. Meanwhile, his storm-gray eyes seemed to look directly at her, and this time she could read his lips as he whispered a single word: "Please." At the same time, her magic responded with such intensity that every piece of metal in her cottage began to vibrate. Because of that direct plea, she felt something fundamental shift in the world's magical balance, a change that left her gasping and certain that time was running out. As a result, when she sensed supernatural presences approaching her forest that afternoon, Ember wasn't surprised. So she began gathering her few possessions, driven by an inexplicable certainty that her life of peaceful isolation was about to end. That's why, when three robed figures emerged from the tree line bearing the Supernatural Council's insignia, she was already waiting for them, which meant she'd unconsciously been preparing for this moment since the visions began. Truth be told, part of her had been expecting this confrontation her entire life. No matter how hard she tried to deny her destiny, the dying throne was calling to her power with magnetic force. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was simply inevitability, but she could no longer ignore what the visions were trying to tell her. They arrived, like death's own messengers. The three council envoys stumbled into her clearing with the hollow-eyed desperation of people watching their world die. Next, Ember emerged from her cottage to meet them, her earlier visions having stripped away any possibility of surprise. From there, she studied their formal robes and the way magical exhaustion seemed to weigh down their every movement. Soon after recognizing the Supernatural Council's silver insignia, her blood chilled with understanding. What followed was the lead envoy's attempt at a respectful bow, a gesture that nearly sent the white-haired woman toppling to the ground. Still, when the envoy spoke, her voice carried unmistakable authority. Yet beneath that commanding tone, Ember heard the same desperate plea that had haunted her visions. "Ember Stormwind, the Luna's throne is dying," the woman gasped, her words tumbling over each other with urgent desperation. Even so, she managed to explain the supernatural realm's crisis with clinical precision, how their magical foundation was failing, how countless Luna candidates had already tried and failed to restore the throne's power. Despite her fear, Ember found herself stepping closer as the envoy described the escalating catastrophe. On the other hand, Watching the three strangers struggle to remain upright made her chest ache with unexpected sympathy. More importantly, when the youngest envoy, barely past boyhood, swayed dangerously on his feet, her healing instincts overrode her caution. In fact, she was kneeling beside him before conscious thought caught up with action. Not only that, but as her fire magic flowed into his weakened body, she felt the same dark hunger she'd sensed in her visions, something that actively consumed magical energy. What's worse, her healing efforts only seemed to slow the drain, not stop it entirely. To make things worse, even as she managed to stabilize the boy temporarily, she could see the life force flickering in all three envoys like dying candles. Moments later, the horrible truth became clear. They were all slowly dying from the same magical plague that was destroying their realm. By the time the lead envoy finished explaining their desperate mission, Ember understood why they'd risked approaching someone with her dangerous reputation. Eventually, she learned that elemental magic users were theoretically the only ones with enough raw power to attempt restoring the Luna's throne. That night, as she tended to her unexpected guests, the weight of their revelations settled over her like a burial shroud. Come morning, she would have to decide whether to risk everything to save strangers or watch the supernatural world collapse while she remained safely hidden. But then the youngest envoy suffered another collapse, blood trickling from his nose as his life force guttered like a flame in strong wind. Instead of retreating to safety, rather, Ember found herself pouring more of her healing magic into his failing body. Meanwhile, the lead envoy watched her efforts with growing hope, and that expression of desperate faith shattered Ember's carefully built emotional walls. At the same time, she realized that her visions hadn't been random. They'd been a call for help from someone who needed her specifically. Because of that understanding, her choice became inevitable. As a result, even as terror clawed at her throat and her hands trembled with the effort of maintaining her healing spell, she heard herself speaking words that would change everything. So when she said, "I'll come with you," it felt less like a decision and more like accepting a fate that had been written in the stars. That's why the relief in the envoy's eyes was almost painful to witness. They'd been carrying the weight of their realm's survival, and now she was volunteering to share that crushing burden. Which meant abandoning the safety she'd spent years building in favor of a destiny that might very well destroy her. Truth be told, as she looked at the dying boy whose life hung in the balance, she realized she'd already made her choice the moment she'd seen that desperate silver-eyed stranger in her visions. No matter how hard she tried to convince herself otherwise, deep down she knew the truth. Some responsibilities couldn't be ignored, no matter how much they terrified her. She didn't know what scared her more, the thought of her dangerous magic failing when the supernatural world needed it most, or the possibility that it might succeed and transform her into something unrecognizable. Before she could change her mind, they began preparations for the most dangerous journey of her life. Death claimed Marcus before they reached the forest's edge. Ember knelt beside his still form, her healing magic flickering uselessly around fingers that trembled with exhaustion and grief. Next, she watched Lydia perform the ritual farewell with hands that shook almost as badly as her own. From there, the harsh reality of their situation settled over them like a suffocating shroud. They were racing against a magical plague that claimed lives faster than hope could sustain them. Soon after the brief ceremony, Lydia struggled to her feet, her face gray with the effort of remaining upright. What followed was a moment of terrible silence as both women stared at the fresh grave and contemplated their own mortality. "How long do we have?" Ember's voice cracked despite her attempt at composure. Still, she needed to understand the timeline they were fighting against. Yet Lydia's answer made her stomach drop into her boots. "Days. Maybe less." Even so, the older woman's determination burned bright, despite her obvious weakness. Despite the grim prognosis, she began shouldering her pack with mechanical precision. On the other hand, Ember felt her elemental magic responding to the growing instability around them, crackling beneath her skin like barely contained lightning. More importantly, every step away from her sanctuary seemed to amplify the chaos within her power, Small earthquakes followed their footsteps, and wildflowers burst into flame wherever her shadow fell. In fact, by midday, she'd accidentally set 3 separate bushes ablaze and cracked a boulder with an uncontrolled surge of earth magic. Not only that, but each incident left her more drained and less able to maintain the careful control that had taken years to develop. What's worse, Lydia's condition deteriorated rapidly as they traveled through increasingly unstable magical territory. To make things worse, the older woman began stumbling more frequently. Her breathing labored, and her skin taking on the same grayish pallor that had preceded Marcus's death. Moments later, when Lydia collapsed completely beside a crystal-clear stream, Ember found herself facing a horrible choice. By the time she'd helped the envoy drink some water and rest against a moss-covered log, the truth became undeniable. Lydia wouldn't survive another day of travel at their current pace. Eventually, as afternoon shadows lengthened around them, Ember made a decision that terrified her more than any magical catastrophe. That night, she would attempt something she'd never tried before, transferring some of her own life force to sustain Lydia long enough to reach Thornspire Peaks. Come morning, if the experimental healing worked, they might both survive the journey. But then again, if it failed, she could accidentally kill them both or drain herself so completely that touching the Luna's throne would become impossible. Instead of dwelling on the risks, rather, she focused on the warm pulse of elemental magic flowing through her veins and the desperate need burning in Lydia's fever-bright eyes. Meanwhile, storm clouds gathered overhead, responding to her emotional turmoil with ominous rumbles of thunder. At the same time, she felt the first stirrings of something vast and powerful calling to her magic from the direction of Thornspire Peaks, a resonance that made her bones ache with longing. Because of that distant pull, her elemental abilities began to stabilize slightly, as if recognizing their true destination. As a result, when she placed her glowing hands on Lydia's chest and began the most dangerous healing she'd ever attempted, her magic flowed with unprecedented clarity. So the life force transfer proceeded smoothly, warming the pallor from Lydia's cheeks and strengthening her faltering heartbeat. That's why, when the older woman's eyes cleared and focused with renewed vitality, Ember allowed herself a moment of cautious hope, which meant they might actually reach the supernatural realm's capital before the magical plague claimed another victim. Truth be told, the successful healing filled her with confidence she hadn't felt since leaving her forest sanctuary. No matter how hard she tried to maintain realistic expectations, the growing resonance between her magic and whatever awaited at Thornspire Peaks suggested that perhaps she was exactly what the dying realm needed. Maybe it was destiny, or maybe it was simply desperation. But as they resumed their journey with renewed vigor, Ember couldn't shake the feeling that every step forward brought her closer to a confrontation that would define the rest of her life. She didn't know what scared her more, the possibility of failing when so many lives hung in the balance, or the terrifying suspicion that succeeding might transform her into someone she wouldn't recognize. Deep down, she knew the truth. By tomorrow evening, they would reach the crystal cavern where the Luna's throne waited, and nothing would ever be the same again. The crystal cavern took her breath away, and not just from its beauty. Power pulsed through the air like a living thing, making Ember's elemental magic dance beneath her skin in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. Next, she followed Lydia deeper into the vast underground chamber, her eyes adjusting to the ethereal blue-white glow emanating from the massive throne at the cavern's heart. From there, she could see how cracks spiderwebbed across its once pristine surface, each fissure bleeding magical energy into the surrounding air. Soon after entering the sacred space, she noticed the man standing beside the failing throne, and her world tilted on its axis. What followed was a moment of perfect recognition as storm-gray eyes met hers across the crystal-lit distance, confirming what her visions had already told her. Still, seeing him in person hit her like a physical blow. Yet despite the shock of finally meeting the desperate stranger from her dreams, she couldn't ignore how exhausted he looked, as if he'd been pouring his own life force into the dying throne for so long that there was barely anything left of him. "Thorne Shadowmere," Lydia announced formally, though her voice carried undertones of concern. Even so, The Alpha King straightened when he saw them, trying to project strength despite the obvious toll his efforts had taken. Despite her nervousness, Ember found herself stepping closer, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had haunted her visions. On the other hand, every instinct warned her that this man was dangerous, not because he meant her harm, but because of what he represented. More importantly, when their eyes locked again, something sparked between them that had nothing to do with the failing magic around them. In fact, the air itself seemed to thicken with potential, as if reality was holding its breath, waiting for something momentous to happen. Not only that, but her elemental magic responded to his presence with unprecedented enthusiasm, fire and earth and air swirling beneath her skin in patterns she'd never experienced. What's worse, she could feel his own power reaching toward hers with equal intensity, creating a resonance that made her teeth ache. To make things worse, the longer they stared at each other, the more the dying throne seemed to react to their proximity. Moments later, cracks that had been bleeding magic began to pulse with renewed energy, as if their combined presence was temporarily stabilizing the ancient artifact. By the time Thorne spoke, his deep voice roughened by exhaustion and something that might have been hope, Ember was trembling with the effort of maintaining her composure. Eventually, his words confirmed what the magical resonance had already told her. "You're her," he said simply, and those two words carried the weight of prophecy. That night, she would learn exactly what her meant in the context of supernatural politics and ancient magic. Come morning, she would understand why the Luna's throne had been calling to her across impossible distances. But then again, perhaps she already understood on some instinctive level that had nothing to do with logic or training. Instead of analyzing the growing connection between them, she focused on the way Thorne's silver-streaked hair caught the throne's ethereal light, and the careful way he moved, as if every gesture required precious energy he couldn't spare. Meanwhile, Lydia explained the situation with clinical precision, detailing Ember's elemental abilities and the desperate circumstances that had brought them here. At the same time, Ember found herself studying Thorne's reactions, noting how his expression shifted from cautious hope to something approaching awe. Because of that growing intensity in his gaze, her magic began to spiral beyond her careful control, sending sparks of elemental energy crackling through the air around them. As a result, when he stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, her power surged in response. So when he reached out tentatively, his fingers stopping just short of touching her glowing hands, the space between them burned with potential energy. That's why his next words carried the weight of both warning and invitation. "Touching the throne will likely kill you," he said quietly, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite identify, which meant he was giving her one last chance to flee before she committed to a path that might destroy them both. Truth be told, the genuine concern in his storm-gray eyes made her chest ache in ways that had nothing to do with magic or destiny. No matter how hard she tried to maintain emotional distance, something about this man called to parts of her that had nothing to do with elemental power. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, strong despite his exhaustion, protective despite his own vulnerability. But she found herself wanting to ease the burdens that weighed so heavily on his shoulders. She didn't know what scared her more, the thought of touching a throne that might kill her, or the realization that this stranger already mattered to her in ways that defied explanation. She touched death and found life instead. Ember's palm met the Luna's throne's cracked surface, expecting agony and oblivion. Next, power beyond anything she'd ever imagined crashed through her system like a tsunami of liquid starlight. From there, instead of the destruction everyone had predicted, her elemental magic merged with the ancient Luna power in perfect, impossible harmony. Soon after the initial shock, she realized she wasn't dying. She was transforming. What followed was the most intense magical awakening in recorded supernatural history, as dormant abilities blazed to life throughout her entire being. Still, the transformation wasn't without pain. Yet as raw power rewrote her magical signature from the inside out, she felt something else happening. a connection forming between her consciousness and Thorne's that went far deeper than simple magical resonance. Even so, she was too overwhelmed by the changes occurring within her own body to fully process what that connection meant. Despite the chaos of her magical evolution, she became aware of Thorne's presence on a fundamental level. On the other hand, this wasn't just awareness. She could feel his emotions as if they were her own, sense his thoughts brushing against the edges of her mind. More importantly, when the throne's power recognized her bloodline and began unlocking abilities she'd never known she possessed, Thorne's own magic stabilized for the first time in years. In fact, the dangerous feedback loop that had been slowly killing him reversed completely, allowing his natural Luna channeling abilities to function properly again. Not only that, but their combined magical signature created something entirely new. A hybrid power source that the throne had been designed to accommodate but had never actually experienced. What's worse, with great power came equally great responsibility, and she could feel the weight of the supernatural realm's survival settling onto her shoulders like a mantle of lead. To make things worse, the bonding process seemed to be permanent. She could sense Thorne's presence even when she closed her eyes. Feel his relief and wonder and growing concern as he processed their new connection. Moments later, when she finally opened her eyes and met his gaze, she knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same. By the time the initial power surge stabilized, leaving her magically transformed and permanently bound to a man she'd met less than an hour ago, the implications began to sink in. Eventually, she understood that becoming Queen of all Lunas meant accepting responsibilities that would reshape every aspect of her carefully controlled existence. That night, as supernatural leaders gathered to witness the throne's miraculous restoration and her unprecedented coronation, she would learn exactly what her new role demanded. Come morning, she would begin training to wield powers that could either save or destroy the supernatural realm. But then, as the immediate crisis passed, and she found herself able to think clearly again, rather, the most shocking realization hit her. Instead of feeling trapped by her new circumstances, she felt complete. Meanwhile, the elemental magic that had always felt chaotic and dangerous now flowed through her with perfect precision, balanced by Luna power that gave her abilities focus and direction. At the same time, the bond with Thorne provided an anchor she hadn't realized she'd been desperately needing. Someone who understood the burden of leadership and the weight of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Because of that shared understanding, the terrifying responsibility of her new role felt manageable for the first time. As a result, when Thorne stepped closer and spoke her new title for the first time, "My Queen," his voice carried respect and something deeper that made her newly awakened magical senses sing with recognition. So she straightened her shoulders and accepted the crown that appeared above her head, wreathed in elemental fire and Luna starlight. That's why, when the assembled supernatural leaders knelt before their new rulers, Ember felt destiny settling around her like armor rather than chains, which meant that perhaps some transformations, no matter how unexpected or overwhelming, were exactly what the universe had always intended. Truth be told, standing beside Thorne in the restored crystal cavern, their combined power humming through the air like music, she couldn't imagine being anywhere else. No matter how drastically her life had changed in a single moment, this felt right in ways her forest sanctuary never had. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was simply the natural consequence of accepting who she was always meant to become. But as Thorne's hand found hers, and their magical bond pulsed with shared purpose, Ember knew she was exactly where she belonged. Power sang through her veins like molten starlight, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Ember stood before the restored Luna's throne, watching supernatural leaders file into the crystal cavern to witness what many were already calling the most significant magical event in centuries. Next, she flexed fingers that now glowed with combined elemental and Luna magic, marveling at abilities that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. From there, she tried to process the magnitude of what had just happened. She'd gone from forest hermit to Queen of all Lunas in the span of a single heartbeat. Soon after the initial crowd gathered, Thorne appeared at her side, his presence both comforting and overwhelming. What followed was her first real glimpse of the supernatural political landscape she'd inherited, as various faction leaders approached with carefully crafted expressions of loyalty and barely concealed calculation. Still, the constant awareness of Thorne's emotions through their new bond made navigating these interactions even more complex. Yet she found herself grateful for his steadying influence when a particularly aggressive pack alpha questioned her qualifications with thinly veiled hostility. "Your Majesty has impressive raw power," the alpha conceded with false civility. Even so, his tone carried clear skepticism about her ability to rule beings she'd never even met before today. Despite her inexperience with supernatural politics, Ember felt her magic respond to the challenge with dangerous intensity. On the other hand, Thorne's calming presence through their bond helped her maintain control when every instinct screamed to demonstrate exactly how powerful she'd become. More importantly, she was beginning to understand that her new abilities came with a constant undercurrent of emotional feedback, not just from Thorne, but from every supernatural being in the cavern. In fact, the collective weight of their hopes, fears, and expectations pressed against her consciousness like a living thing. Not only that, but each new person who approached seemed to trigger different aspects of her awakened powers, making her magical signature fluctuate unpredictably. What's worse, she could see the concern in Thorne's storm-gray eyes as he monitored her struggle to maintain stability. To make things worse, when a group of Luna descendants arrived to formally acknowledge her authority, the throne itself began reacting to their combined magical signatures. Moments later, power surged through the crystal structure with enough force to make the entire cavern tremble. By the time she managed to calm both the throne and her own chaotic abilities, sweat beaded along her forehead despite the cavern's cool air. Eventually, Thorne stepped closer, his hand finding her elbow in a gesture that looked casual but provided crucial magical grounding. That night, as the formal presentations continued, and she struggled to remember names, titles, and political alliances, Ember began to grasp the true scope of her new responsibilities. Come morning, she would begin intensive training to control powers that could reshape the supernatural world, or accidentally destroy it. But then, during a brief lull in the proceedings, she caught sight of her reflection in the throne's polished surface. Instead of the frightened hermit she'd been that morning, a confident woman with eyes that blazed with elemental fire stared back at her. Meanwhile, Thorne's voice rumbled close to her ear as he provided whispered context for the various supernatural factions paying their respects. At the same time, she felt his genuine relief and wonder through their bond, emotions so powerful they nearly brought tears to her eyes. Because of that emotional support, when the final group approached and she spoke her first official decree as queen, establishing new protections for elemental magic users, her voice carried the authority of someone born to lead. As a result, the supernatural leaders responded with genuine respect rather than mere political necessity. So as the formal ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Thorne remained at her side, his presence both anchor and promise. That's why, when he finally spoke, his words carried weight that had nothing to do with royal protocol. "You're going to be magnificent at this," he said quietly, his faith in her abilities blazing through their bond like sunlight, which meant that perhaps, despite her fears and inexperience, she might actually be capable of the greatness everyone seemed to expect. Truth be told, standing in the crystal cavern surrounded by the evidence of her magical transformation, she was beginning to believe it herself. Magic fought her like a wild animal, claws and teeth and desperate fury. Ember gritted her teeth as another training exercise went catastrophically wrong, sending sheets of elemental fire cascading across the practice chamber, while earth magic cracked the stone floor beneath her feet. Next, Thorne approached with careful steps, his own power radiating the controlled calm she desperately needed to learn. From there, he began the patient process of talking her through the breathing techniques that would help her find balance between her chaotic elemental abilities and the structured Luna magic. Soon after her latest magical explosion, she sank onto a carved stone bench, frustration burning in her throat like unshed tears. What followed was Thorne's quiet presence beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, but not so close as to overwhelm her already overstimulated magical senses. "I nearly killed 3 people yesterday," she whispered, the memory of her uncontrolled power surge making her stomach clench with guilt. Still, Thorne's expression remained patient and understanding rather than concerned or disappointed. Yet when he began sharing stories of his own early struggles with Luna magic, including a particularly embarrassing incident involving accidentally turning his hair silver during a formal dinner, she found herself laughing despite her frustration. Even so, the underlying message was clear. Everyone struggled with new magical abilities, even those born to supernatural royalty. Despite his reassurances, she couldn't shake the fear that her elemental nature made her fundamentally different from previous Luna rulers. On the other hand, when their practice session resumed and their magical energies began to synchronize properly for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. More importantly, the moment their powers found harmony, everything clicked into place with startling clarity. In fact, the chaotic fire that had been scorching everything in sight suddenly became precise and controlled, responding to her will with surgical precision rather than wild abandon. Not only that, but through their bond, she could feel Thorne's genuine amazement at the elegance of their combined magical signature. What's worse, the success was so intoxicating that she immediately wanted to push further, test the limits of what they could accomplish together. To make things worse, that eagerness nearly led to disaster when she attempted a complex earth-shaping technique without proper preparation. Moments later, the practice chamber's walls began to buckle inward, threatening to crush them both beneath tons of carved stone. By the time Thorne managed to help her reverse the damage, both of them were breathing hard and covered in rock dust. Eventually, as they sat among the debris of her latest magical mishap, she began to understand why her training was proceeding so slowly. That night, as she reviewed the day's lessons and nursed bruises from falling rocks, the pattern became clear. Come morning, she would need to stop fighting her elemental nature and start integrating it with Luna magic, instead of trying to suppress one in favor of the other. But then, as she prepared for sleep in her new royal chambers, a soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. Instead of the servant she expected, Thorne stood in her doorway with 2 steaming mugs of tea and an expression that suggested he understood exactly what she was struggling with. Meanwhile, as they sat before her fireplace sipping the soothing herbal blend, he began sharing details about his own magical education and the years it had taken him to master abilities that seemed natural now. At the same time, she felt his memories through their bond. The frustration, the fear of inadequacy, the crushing weight of everyone's expectations. Because of that shared understanding, when he suggested they try a different approach to training, one that worked with her elemental instincts rather than against them, she found herself nodding with renewed determination. As a result, their conversation shifted from commiseration to strategic planning, mapping out new techniques that might help her find the balance she desperately needed. So when he finally left her chambers with a gentle goodnight that carried undertones of affection and support, she felt genuinely hopeful about tomorrow's training session. That's why, as she settled into bed with elemental magic humming contentedly beneath her skin, sleep came easier than it had since her transformation began. Which meant that perhaps learning to be a magical queen was like learning any other skill. It simply required patience, practice, and the right teacher. The shadow creatures struck without warning, pouring through the palace's outer defenses like liquid darkness given hunger and purpose. Ember jolted awake to the sound of alarms echoing through the crystal corridors, her newly awakened magical senses screaming danger before her conscious mind fully processed the threat. Next, she threw on her clothes and raced toward the source of the disturbance, following the acrid scent of burned magic and the distant sounds of combat. From there, she burst into the main courtyard to find supernatural guards locked in desperate battle with entities that seemed to absorb light itself. Soon after joining the fight, she realized her training exercises had done nothing to prepare her for actual combat. What followed was a terrifying crash course in magical warfare as shadow creatures targeted her specifically, their alien intelligence clearly recognizing her as the greatest threat to their mission. Still, when the first creature lunged at her with claws that could tear through solid stone, her elemental magic responded with devastating efficiency. Yet the fire that erupted from her hands was chaotic and wild, as dangerous to her allies as to her enemies. Even so, adrenaline and desperation combined to unlock combat instincts she hadn't known she possessed. Despite her lack of formal training, raw power and protective fury made her a formidable opponent, at least until fear began to undermine her control. On the other hand, watching Thorne fight with the lethal grace of someone born to supernatural warfare filled her with equal parts admiration and terror. More importantly, seeing him in true danger triggered something primal in her magical core, something that had nothing to do with Luna power and everything to do with protecting what belonged to her. In fact, when a shadow creature managed to rake its claws across his shoulder, drawing blood that glowed silver in the moonlight, her elemental magic exploded outward with unprecedented fury. Not only that, but the resulting firestorm incinerated 3 creatures instantly while simultaneously cracking the courtyard's stone foundations. What's worse, the magical backlash from her uncontrolled surge sent her staggering, vision blurring as power threatened to consume her from within. To make things worse, more shadow creatures poured through the breach her magic had accidentally created in the palace's protective barriers. Moments later, Thorne appeared at her side, his own magic flaring to reinforce her failing control while he continued fighting with deadly precision. By the time they managed to drive off the remaining attackers, dawn was breaking over the horizon and half the courtyard lay in smoking ruins. Eventually, as supernatural healers tended to the wounded and guards worked to repair the damaged defenses, the true scope of the attack became clear. That night, someone had sent these creatures specifically to test her abilities and probe for weaknesses in their new magical bond. Come morning, intelligence reports would confirm what she'd already begun to suspect. This was just the beginning of a campaign designed to destroy her before she could fully master her inherited powers. But then, as exhaustion and delayed shock set in, rather she found herself focusing on a more immediate concern. Instead of celebrating their victory, she stared at the destruction her uncontrolled magic had caused and felt sick with self-recrimination. Meanwhile, Thorne's gentle hands on her shoulders provided both comfort and grounding as she struggled with the realization that her fear-driven power could be as dangerous as any enemy. At the same time, through their bond, she felt his genuine concern for her emotional state rather than anger about the collateral damage. Because of that unwavering support, she was able to voice the fear that had been growing since her magical awakening. As a result, when she whispered, "What if I become the very thing everyone should fear?" his immediate and fierce denial carried the weight of absolute conviction. So his next words provided the reassurance she desperately needed to hear. "Your heart makes you strong, not dangerous," he said firmly, silver eyes blazing with protective intensity. That's why, despite the evidence of destruction around them, she found herself believing that perhaps control would come with time and practice, which meant that even though tonight's battle had revealed new vulnerabilities and challenges, it had also proven that she was capable of defending what mattered most. Truth be told, standing in the courtyard surrounded by evidence of both her power and her potential for catastrophe, she felt more determined than ever to master the abilities that could either save or doom them all. The ancient crystal array shattered like her hopes, sending magical shockwaves through the sacred chamber. Ember stared at the smoking remains of what should have been their salvation, a complex ritual designed to permanently strengthen the Luna's throne's power. Next, she felt Thorne's disappointment and exhaustion bleeding through their bond, adding to her own crushing sense of failure. From there, she watched supernatural leaders exchange worried glances as the implications of their botched attempt became clear. Soon after the initial shock wore off, the real damage began to manifest. What followed was a series of magical instabilities rippling outward from the failed ritual site, weakening protective barriers that had stood for centuries. Still, it wasn't the destruction that made her chest ache with self-recrimination. It was the knowledge that her emotional walls had caused the failure. Yet even as guilt threatened to overwhelm her, she could feel Thorne's unwavering support through their bond, his faith in her abilities unshaken despite the catastrophic results. "We were so close," she whispered, staring at her hands as if they belonged to a stranger. Even so, the genuine devastation in her voice made several council members shift uncomfortably, clearly questioning whether their new queen possessed the emotional stability required for such dangerous magical workings. Despite their doubt, Thorne moved to stand beside her, his presence both comfort and reminder that they were in this together. On the other hand, she could sense his own frustration with her continued resistance to true vulnerability, the very openness their magical harmony required. More importantly, Master Aldrich, the realm's most senior magical theorist, cleared his throat before delivering the news they'd all been dreading. In fact, his preliminary analysis suggested that the failed ritual had actually accelerated the throne's deterioration rather than stabilizing it. Not only that, but the magical feedback had damaged several other protective artifacts throughout the palace, leaving them more vulnerable than ever. What's worse, energy readings indicated that the shadow creatures from the previous night's attack had been drawn by the very instabilities they'd just created. To make things worse, reports began flooding in from across the supernatural realm. Barrier failures, magical anomalies, and increased shadow creature activity in areas that should have been completely secure. Moments later, the horrible truth became undeniable. Their attempt to fix the crisis had made everything exponentially worse. By the time the emergency council session convened, the scope of the disaster was staggering. Eventually, Ember found herself facing a room full of supernatural leaders who looked at her with expressions ranging from barely concealed panic to outright accusation. That night, as she paced her chambers trying to process the magnitude of their failure, the weight of responsibility threatened to crush her spirit entirely. Come morning, they would need to devise a new plan, one that accounted for her apparent inability to achieve the emotional openness their magic required. But then Thorne appeared in her doorway, his storm-gray eyes blazing with determination rather than disappointment. Instead of the recriminations she expected, he crossed the room and pulled her into his arms with gentle ferocity. Meanwhile, his whispered words against her hair carried a promise that made her elemental magic stir with renewed hope. At the same time, she felt his absolute conviction through their bond. He believed in them, in their ability to overcome whatever obstacles stood in their way. Because of that unwavering faith, she found herself clinging to him like an anchor in a storm. As a result, for the first time since the ritual's failure, she allowed herself to truly feel his emotions alongside her own. So when he pulled back to meet her eyes, the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. That's why his next words carried the weight of both challenge and invitation. "Tomorrow, we try a different approach," he said quietly, which meant he wasn't giving up on their bond or their mission, despite every reason to doubt her emotional readiness. Truth be told, the fierce protectiveness she felt radiating through their connection gave her courage she hadn't known she possessed. No matter how badly she'd failed today, his faith in their partnership remained unshakable. Ancient texts don't lie, and this one spoke of horrors beyond imagination. Ember's hands trembled as she read the passage that changed everything, her newly enhanced magical senses confirming the authenticity of words that had been hidden for millennia. Next, she looked up from the crumbling manuscript to find Thorne's expression mirroring her own horror as the implications sank in. From there, they exchanged a glance that carried the weight of terrible understanding. Soon after Master Aldrich finished translating the final passages, the silence in the archive chamber became suffocating. What followed was the systematic destruction of every assumption they'd held about their enemy and their mission. "Void seekers," Thorne's voice was barely above a whisper, but the name carried enough menace to make several council members flinch. Still, speaking the enemy's true identity aloud somehow made the threat more real and infinitely more terrifying. Yet as horrifying as the revelation was, it also provided crucial insight into their failures. Even so, learning that their foe was an ancient force specifically designed to consume magical energy explained why conventional approaches had proven useless. Despite the overwhelming nature of the threat, Ember felt something shift inside her as she absorbed the full scope of their situation. On the other hand, knowing exactly what they were fighting gave her a strange sense of relief. At least now they understood why everything seemed hopeless. More importantly, buried within the ancient warnings was a single passage that made her elemental magic sing with recognition. In fact, the text described a theoretical fusion of elemental and Luna powers that could theoretically create barriers the Void Seekers couldn't penetrate. Not only that, but the fusion required something she'd been avoiding since her transformation: complete emotional and magical unity with her bonded partner. What's worse, the text was explicit about the risks involved. Failure would likely result in the destruction of both participants. To make things worse, Master Aldrich's analysis suggested they had perhaps hours before the Void Seekers breached the realm's final defensive barriers. Moments later, as if summoned by their discovery, alarms began echoing through the palace as shadow creatures launched another assault. By the time they reached the main courtyard, the attack was unlike anything they'd faced before. Eventually, it became clear that this wasn't a probing raid, but a full-scale invasion designed to prevent them from implementing whatever solution the ancient texts might provide. That night, as they fought desperately to hold the palace's inner defenses, Ember made a decision that terrified her more than any enemy. Come morning, she would either be dead or transformed beyond recognition by the most dangerous magical working in recorded history. But then, in the midst of combat, she felt Thorne's absolute trust blazing through their bond like starfire. Instead of fear, she sensed his complete willingness to risk everything alongside her. Meanwhile, shadow creatures pressed closer to the throne chamber, their alien hunger growing stronger with each barrier they destroyed. At the same time, she realized that traditional defenses were useless against beings that fed on the very magic used to create protective spells. Because of that understanding, when the final barrier began to crack, she made her choice. As a result, she reached for Thorne's hand and spoke words that would either save their realm or destroy them both. So as their combined power blazed to life in response to her decision, she felt destiny clicking into place around them like armor. That's why, even as terror clawed at her throat, she knew this was the moment everything had been building toward, which meant that by dawn, they would either stand victorious as the unified force the ancient prophecies described, or their realm would fall to darkness eternal. Hell erupted in the throne chamber as reality itself began to tear. Void Seekers poured through dimensional rifts like liquid nightmare, their forms shifting and writhing as they consumed the very air around them. Next, Ember felt her elemental magic recoil in instinctive terror as the creature's alien hunger pressed against her consciousness. From there, she watched in horror as several supernatural guards simply ceased, their life forces drained so completely that not even memories remained. Soon after the initial breach, the Luna's throne began resonating with harmonics that made her teeth ache and her vision blur. What followed was the most terrifying sight she'd ever witnessed: the ancient artifact starting to crack along completely new fracture lines, as if the Void Seeker's presence was accelerating its destruction beyond all previous projections. Still, even as chaos engulfed the chamber, she felt Thorne's presence through their bond like an anchor in a hurricane. Yet the psychic pressure from the Void Seekers was interfering with their connection, making it harder to maintain the emotional openness their unified magic required. Now or never. Thorne's voice cut through the supernatural screaming as another guard vanished into nothingness. Even so, his storm-gray eyes held steady determination despite the apocalyptic scene unfolding around them. Despite every instinct screaming at her to flee, Ember stepped closer to the failing throne and reached for the terrifying unity the ancient texts demanded. On the other hand, fear of complete vulnerability warred with desperate necessity as Void Seekers closed in from all sides. More importantly, She could feel the creature's attention focusing on her specifically, drawn by the unique magical signature of her elemental Luna fusion. In fact, their hunger intensified exponentially when they sensed her potential, confirming what the ancient warnings had predicted. Not only that, but Master Aldrich's desperate shouts from across the chamber revealed another horrifying truth. The Void Seekers weren't just invading their realm, they were using the throne itself as a gateway to consume every magical dimension simultaneously. What's worse, each second of delay brought total magical extinction closer to inevitability. To make things worse, when Ember finally surrendered her emotional barriers completely and reached for true unity with Thorne, the initial power surge attracted every Void Seeker in the chamber. Moments later, their combined assault nearly shattered her concentration before the fusion could stabilize. By the time she managed to regain focus, half the chamber lay in ruins and Thorne was bleeding from wounds that glowed with unnatural darkness. Eventually, through their deepening bond, she felt his absolute determination to see their mission through, regardless of personal cost. That night would be remembered as either the supernatural realm's salvation or its final hour. Come morning, if there was a morning, the balance of magical power in all dimensions would be fundamentally different. But then, as she felt Thorne's life force beginning to waver under the Void Seeker's assault, something primal awakened in her elemental core. Instead of the careful control she'd been practicing, raw, protective fury blazed through her magical channels with devastating intensity. Meanwhile, their bond deepened beyond anything the ancient texts had described, creating resonance patterns that made the attacking creatures hesitate for the first time since their arrival. At the same time, she realized that love, not just unity, was the key element missing from every previous attempt. Because of that revelation, when she finally achieved perfect fusion with Thorne's Luna magic, their combined power didn't just stabilize the throne. As a result, it began transforming the ancient artifact into something entirely new, something the Void Seekers couldn't consume or corrupt. So, as reality reshaped itself around their unprecedented magical working, she felt destiny and choice converging into a single moment of absolute possibility. That's why, when she spoke the final words of the Unity ritual, her voice carried the authority of someone who had found her true strength, which meant that the next few seconds would determine whether love and unity could triumph over hunger and dissolution. Terror and love warred in her chest as Ember made the choice that would either save or destroy them both. "I have to tell you something," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of supernatural forces mobilizing outside the throne chamber. Next, she met Thorne's storm-gray eyes and felt her carefully constructed emotional walls crumble like ancient parchment. From there, words she'd never spoken aloud began pouring out in a desperate rush. Soon after she started talking, the memories came flooding back. The fire that had consumed her childhood home, her parents' screams as her uncontrolled magic turned their sanctuary into a death trap. What followed was the raw confession of how she'd carried that guilt for 15 years, believing herself to be nothing more than a weapon disguised as a person. "I killed them," she choked out, tears streaming down her face as Thorne's hands found hers. Still, even as shame threatened to drown her, she forced herself to continue. Yet his expression never wavered from absolute acceptance, his faith in her blazing through their bond like sunlight. Even so, the hardest part was admitting how much she wanted this. Wanted him, wanted their connection, wanted a future where her power brought life instead of death. Despite every reason to doubt herself, his unwavering belief made her feel worthy of the love she'd never dared to imagine. On the other hand, sharing her deepest trauma with someone who could feel her emotions firsthand required courage she'd never known she possessed. More importantly, when he pulled her into his arms and whispered forgiveness for sins that had haunted her for years, something fundamental shifted in her magical core. In fact, the elemental chaos that had plagued her since childhood finally found perfect harmony with his Luna magic, creating resonance patterns that made the very air around them sing. Not only that, but their emotional connection deepened beyond simple magical compatibility into something that felt like coming home. What's worse was how desperately she needed this unity, even knowing it made her more vulnerable than she'd ever been. To make things worse, the approaching Void Seekers could sense their growing power, their attacks intensifying in direct response to the lovers' deepening bond. Moments later, as their magic stabilized into true partnership, she felt invincible and terrified in equal measure. By the time Thorne spoke his own confessions, his fears of inadequacy, his lonely years of leadership, his desperate love for the woman who'd saved his realm, she understood that vulnerability was strength, not weakness. Eventually, as they stood together in the crystal chamber with their souls laid bare, the Luna's throne responded to their unity with unprecedented energy. That night would test everything they'd built together. But then, as the first wave of shadow creatures breached their outer defenses, she felt ready for whatever came next. Instead of hiding from her power, she embraced it completely for the first time in her life. Meanwhile, Thorne's love blazed through their bond like armor made of starlight. At the same time, she knew that whatever happened next, they would face it as true partners. Because of their perfect unity, when the real battle began, they were ready. Power flowed between them like liquid starfire as they saved lives that moments before had seemed lost forever. Ember knelt beside the dying council member, her hands glowing with combined elemental and Luna magic, while Thorne channeled energy through their bond with surgical precision. Next, she watched in amazement as their unified power reversed damage that should have been irreversible, healing wounds that had been draining magical life force for days. From there, they moved to the next victim, their magic working in perfect harmony to counteract the Void Seeker's devastating drain. Soon after their third successful healing, she began to understand the true scope of what their partnership could accomplish. What followed was a systematic restoration of dozens of supernatural beings who had been written off as casualties of the ongoing magical crisis. Still, each healing required complete emotional openness between them, demanding a level of vulnerability that left them both spiritually exhausted. Yet seeing the gratitude and hope in the eyes of those they saved made every moment of discomfort worthwhile. Even so, their success attracted attention they hadn't anticipated. Despite their attempts to work quietly, word of their miraculous healing spread throughout the palace with supernatural speed. On the other hand, as more victims were brought to them, the pattern of injuries revealed something horrifying. More importantly, the Void Seekers weren't just randomly draining magical energy, they were specifically targeting the most powerful supernatural beings in systematic fashion. In fact, the attack pattern suggested an intelligence behind the assault that was far more sophisticated than anyone had realized. Not only that, but their healing successes seemed to be drawing stronger opposition, as if something was actively trying to prevent their intervention. What's worse, Master Aldrich's analysis of the healed victims revealed residual void energy that defied every known purification technique. To make things worse, the traces suggested that the Void Seekers were somehow marking their targets for future consumption. Moments later, alarms began echoing through the palace as sensors detected massive void energy signatures approaching from multiple directions. By the time they reached the command center, it became clear that their healing successes had triggered a coordinated response from something far more dangerous than the shadow creatures they'd faced before. Eventually, the truth became undeniable. They weren't just fighting random void spawn, but the advanced scouts of something ancient and malevolent. That night, they would face the true architects of the supernatural realm's destruction. Come morning, if they survived, the magical world would never be the same. But then, as reports flooded in about void creatures systematically targeting every location where they'd performed healings, the implications hit her like a physical blow. Instead of random attacks, this was a coordinated campaign designed to undo their progress and demoralize their resistance. Meanwhile, she felt Thorne's grim determination through their bond as he processed the same horrifying realization. Because of their success, They had painted targets on everyone they'd tried to save. As a result, the approaching battle would be as much about protecting their previous victories as achieving new ones. Darkness given form stepped through reality itself, and Ember's blood turned to ice in her veins. The Void Lord's presence twisted the very air around him, making shadows writhe like living things, while his alien hunger pressed against her consciousness with crushing weight. Next, she felt Thorne's protective fury blazing through their bond as the entity's attention focused on her specifically, its ancient malice recognizing the threat she represented. From there, supernatural defenders throughout the palace began collapsing as the creature's mere presence drained their life forces faster than they could recover. Soon after the Void Lord materialized fully in their dimension, she understood why the ancient texts had spoken of it in terms usually reserved for natural disasters. What followed was a systematic assault on reality itself as the entity began unweaving the fundamental magical structures that held their realm together. So, the Void Lord's voice resonated with harmonics that made her teeth ache. This is the fusion that thinks it can oppose entropy itself. Still, despite the creature's contemptuous tone, she could sense its genuine concern about their combined abilities. Yet even as terror threatened to overwhelm her, she felt Thorne's unwavering presence through their bond, his love providing an anchor of light in the growing darkness. Even so, the Void Lord's psychic pressure made it increasingly difficult to maintain the emotional openness their unified magic required. Despite the overwhelming opposition, she forced herself to step forward, elemental fire blazing around her hands in defiant response to the creature's challenge. On the other hand, every instinct screamed at her to flee from something that could unmake her existence with a thought. More importantly, the ancient entity's next words revealed the true scope of their desperate situation. In fact, the Void Lord casually mentioned consuming 17 other magical dimensions before discovering their realm, treating apocalyptic destruction like a casual meal. Not only that, but it began demonstrating its power by selectively draining the life force from supernatural defenders, choosing victims with deliberate cruelty. What's worse, each death seemed to strengthen the creature, while simultaneously weakening the barriers protecting their throne chamber. To make things worse, when she and Thorne combined their magic to shield the remaining survivors, the Void Lord laughed with genuine amusement. Moments later, it began explaining exactly how their resistance was ultimately futile, detailing the mathematical inevitability of entropy's victory over order. By the time the creature finished its monologue, half the palace lay in ruins, and dozens of supernatural beings had been reduced to empty husks. Eventually, as the Void Lord prepared to end their resistance permanently, she realized that conventional magic, even their unprecedented fusion, might not be enough. That night, as reality itself began to unravel around them, she would need to find strength beyond anything the ancient texts had imagined. Come morning, if there was a morning, either love would prove stronger than cosmic entropy, or everything would end. But then, as the Void Lord raised its hand for the killing blow, rather, she felt something new stirring in the depths of their magical bond. Instead of just elemental and Luna power, raw creative force began flowing between them. Meanwhile, she realized that the entity's greatest weakness might be its inability to understand connections based on love rather than hunger. Blood painted the crystal walls as Ember's world shattered around her. Council member Lydia crumpled to the floor, her life force completely drained despite Ember's desperate attempts to heal her. Next, she watched helplessly as 3 more supernatural leaders collapsed in rapid succession, their deaths feeding the Void Lord's growing power. From there, she felt each loss like a physical blow, guilt and rage warring in her chest as her protective magic proved insufficient against the ancient entity's hunger. Soon after the 5th death, something broke inside her, not just emotionally but magically. What followed was a catastrophic surge of uncontrolled elemental power that cracked the throne chamber's walls and sent everyone scrambling for cover. "I can't save them," she sobbed, her voice raw with despair as Thorne's arms encircled her trembling form. Still, Even his unwavering support couldn't quiet the voice in her head that whispered she was exactly what she'd always feared: destruction disguised as salvation. Yet through their bond, she felt his own crushing guilt as more supernatural beings died despite their combined efforts. Even so, the Void Lord continued its systematic assault, choosing victims with deliberate cruelty to maximize their psychological torment. Despite their unprecedented magical fusion, they were losing the war one life at a time. On the other hand, each failed rescue attempt seemed to strengthen the entity while weakening their own resolve and magical coherence. More importantly, Master Aldrich's final transmission before his capture revealed the scope of their failure. Void rifts were opening throughout the supernatural realm, turning their once safe territories into hunting grounds for shadow creatures. In fact, entire communities were being consumed while she struggled uselessly to protect a single chamber. Not only that, but the Luna's throne itself was beginning to crack again, their emotional instability disrupting the magical fusion that had temporarily stabilized it. What's worse, each new fracture released more void energy into their dimension, accelerating the realm's collapse. To make things worse, when she attempted one final healing on a dying child who'd been brought to the throne chamber for sanctuary, her magic simply failed. Moments later, as the little girl's light faded forever, something died inside Ember that she wasn't sure could ever be restored. By the time the chamber fell silent, except for the Void Lord's satisfied laughter, she understood the true meaning of despair. Eventually, as Thorne held her while she wept for all the lives she couldn't save, the weight of failure settled over them like a burial shroud. That night, the supernatural realm burned while their prophesied saviors broke down completely. Come morning, there might not be a realm left to save. Horror crept through their magical connection like venom, and Ember felt Thorne dying by inches. The corrupted throne pulsed with malevolent energy, each beat drawing more life force from her bonded partner despite her desperate attempts to sever the connection. Next, she watched his silver-streaked hair turn completely white as years of his life were drained away in minutes. From there, panic clawed at her throat as she realized their magical bond, once their greatest strength, had become the instrument of his destruction. Soon after the corruption began spreading through their connection, she felt the Void Lord's satisfaction bleeding through the link like poison. What followed was the horrifying realization that the entity had been manipulating their bond from the moment they'd achieved unity. "Cut the connection," Thorne gasped, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth as the throne's corruption ravaged his magical core. Still, when she reached for the mental threads that bound them together, her elemental magic recoiled as if touching molten metal. Yet every attempt to break their bond only seemed to accelerate the draining process, turning her own power against the man she loved. Even so, she kept trying, tears streaming down her face as she watched him grow weaker with each passing moment. Despite his obvious agony, Thorne used their connection to project calm and love, trying to shield her from the worst of his pain. On the other hand, feeling his selfless protection while being unable to save him was torture beyond anything she'd ever imagined. More importantly, the corruption spreading through their bond was beginning to affect her own magical stability, making her elemental abilities increasingly chaotic and dangerous. In fact, when she attempted to channel healing energy to him, the power emerged as destructive force that scorched the floor around them. Not only that, but Master Aldrich's warnings about magical parasites proved prophetically accurate. The Void Lord had infected their connection with something that fed on love itself. What's worse, the stronger their emotional bond, the faster the corruption spread. To make things worse, she could feel Thorne's memories beginning to fade as the throne consumed not just his life force but his very essence. Moments later, when he failed to recognize her for a terrifying handful of seconds, she understood that death would be merciful compared to this systematic erasure. By the time she realized the only way to save him would require destroying the bond that had given their lives meaning, he was barely conscious. Eventually, as his breathing became labored and his heartbeat irregular, she faced the most impossible choice of her life. That night, she would have to choose between preserving their love and preserving his existence. Come morning, one way or another, everything would be different. But then, in a moment of painful clarity, Thorne spoke words that shattered what remained of her resolve. Rather than begging her to save him, he whispered, "Promise me you'll choose the realm." The knife felt like salvation and damnation in her trembling hands. Ember stared at the enchanted blade Master Aldrich had provided, the only tool capable of severing a magical bond permanently, while Thorne's life ebbed away before her eyes. Next, she felt the weight of impossible choice crushing down on her shoulders: cut their connection and save his life while dooming the supernatural realm, or maintain their unity and watch the man she loved die to preserve a power that might not even be enough to stop the Void Lord. From there, tears blurred her vision as she raised the blade toward the silver cord of energy that connected their souls. Soon after positioning the knife, she hesitated at the sound of his labored breathing, each rasp a reminder of what she was about to lose forever. What followed was the most agonizing moment of her existence, as she forced herself to consider a future without their magical and emotional bond. "I can't do this," she sobbed, the blade shaking in her grip as Thorne's hand found hers with what little strength he had left. Still, when she met his storm-gray eyes, now dimmed with approaching death, she saw only love and understanding, no trace of accusation or fear. Yet his next words carried the weight of prophecy and sacrifice combined. Even so, she could barely process their meaning through the haze of grief and desperation that clouded her thoughts. "The realm needs you whole," he whispered, each word an obvious struggle. Despite his weakening condition, his faith in her mission never wavered, even as it broke her heart completely. On the other hand, she could feel the Void Lord's satisfaction through their corrupted connection, the entity's pleasure at forcing her into this impossible situation. More importantly, she understood that this moment had been orchestrated from the beginning. Her greatest strength turned into her most devastating weakness. In fact, cutting their bond wouldn't just end their magical partnership, it would strip away half of her power and leave her emotionally shattered. Not only that, but without their unity, the Luna's throne would destabilize completely, making any victory against the Void Lord impossible. What's worse, preserving their connection meant watching Thorne die slowly while his essence fed the very corruption they were fighting. To make things worse, each moment of hesitation brought him closer to a death that would destroy them both anyway. Moments later, as his grip on her hand weakened to almost nothing, the cruel mathematics of their situation became crystal clear. By the time she fully understood the trap they'd fallen into, it was almost too late to save anything at all. Eventually, as the corruption began spreading into her own magical core through their bond, she realized that love sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice. That night, she would learn whether destroying her own heart could somehow save the world. Come morning, if there was a morning, either the supernatural realm would have a broken queen who'd lost everything for duty, or nothing would remain but void and silence. But then, as Thorne's eyes began to close for what might be the final time, rather, she heard words that changed everything. Instead of goodbye, he whispered, "Remember what we built together." Meanwhile, she felt something stirring in the deepest part of their bond, not corruption, but the pure love that had created their unity in the first place. At the same time, she realized that perhaps the choice wasn't between him and the realm, but between fear and the kind of love that could transcend even death itself. Because love like theirs couldn't be destroyed by any blade, no matter how sharp or magical. Love blazed between their souls like a star refusing to die. In the moment when all seemed lost, Ember felt something magnificent stirring in the deepest core of their bond. Not the corruption that was killing Thorne, but the pure creative force that had first brought them together. Next, she dropped the severing blade and pressed her palms against his chest, choosing trust over fear as their connection pulsed with renewed light. From there, she reached past the Void Lord's poison to touch the essence of what they'd built together. Soon after her decision to fight for their bond rather than destroy it, the corruption began to retreat like shadows before dawn. What followed was the most beautiful sight she'd ever witnessed, Thorne's eyes brightening as their love proved stronger than the entity's malevolence. "I felt you calling me back," he whispered, his voice gaining strength with each word as their purified connection restored what had been drained away. Still, the effort of cleansing their bond left them both exhausted and vulnerable to whatever the Void Lord might attempt next. Yet something fundamental had changed in the quality of their magic. Where before their unity had been powerful but unstable, now it hummed with crystalline clarity. Even so, she could sense the ancient entity's fury through the dimensional barriers, its rage at being denied what should have been an easy victory. Despite their renewed strength, the challenges ahead remained overwhelming. On the other hand, for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt genuinely hopeful about their chances of survival. More importantly, their purified bond revealed new possibilities that neither of them had imagined, ways of combining their abilities that transcended simple magical fusion. In fact, as they explored these enhanced capabilities together, she began to understand why the Void Lord had tried so desperately to corrupt their connection. Not only that, but their love-strengthened unity was creating resonance patterns that actually repelled void energy rather than simply resisting it. What's worse for their enemies, the purification process had left them immune to the corruption tactics that had nearly destroyed them. To make things even more hopeful, Master Aldrich's voice crackled through the communication crystal with news that changed everything. Moments later, his report confirmed what their enhanced magical senses were already detecting. Supernatural communities throughout the realm were rallying to their cause. By the time they fully processed the implications, it became clear that their victory over the bond's corruption had sent ripples of hope throughout their dimension. Eventually, scattered resistance groups began coordinating their efforts, drawn together by the beacon of possibility their love represented. That night, instead of facing their enemies alone, they would lead a united supernatural realm into battle. Come morning, the final confrontation would determine whether love and unity could triumph over entropy and despair. But then, as reports flooded in about void rifts closing spontaneously in response to their purified bond, she understood that their personal victory was already reshaping the larger conflict. Instead of fighting a defensive battle against inevitable defeat, they were now positioned to take the offensive against an enemy that had never faced truly unified opposition. Power called to power across the supernatural realm as allies emerged from the darkness. Ember stood before the assembled representatives of every surviving supernatural community, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced the void and emerged stronger. Next, she felt Thorne's unwavering support through their bond, as she outlined their desperate plan to strike at the Void Lord's dimensional anchor before it could complete its consumption of their realm. From there, she watched hardened warriors and ancient scholars nod in grim agreement, united by necessity and hope in equal measure. Soon after her speech concluded, the real work began, coordinating magical abilities that had never been combined, creating battle strategies that accounted for enemies that could unmake reality itself. What followed was the most complex magical working in recorded supernatural history, as dozens of different power sources were woven into a unified assault formation. "We have one chance," Master Aldrich announced, his voice carrying the weight of calculations that had taken all night to complete. Still, despite the overwhelming odds, she could see determination burning in every face around the war table. Yet, even as their allies prepared for the final battle, reports continued flooding in about accelerating void rifts and shadow creature attacks. Even so, each new challenge seemed to strengthen their resolve rather than weaken it. Despite the approaching deadline, she took time to personally connect with key allies, using her enhanced empathic abilities to forge bonds that would hold under combat stress. On the other hand, some supernatural beings remained skeptical of trusting their lives to someone so newly awakened to her powers. More importantly, the weapon they were preparing required contributions from magical traditions that had been enemies for centuries. In fact, Convincing ancient rivals to work together was proving almost as challenging as the coming battle itself. Not only that, but the spell formation demanded perfect timing from participants scattered across multiple dimensions. One mistake could doom them all. What's worse, they would need to maintain magical coordination while under attack from creatures specifically designed to disrupt supernatural abilities. To make things more complex, the Void Lord was actively hunting their key allies, forcing them to work under constant threat of discovery and elimination. Moments later, when 3 more void rifts opened simultaneously near their staging areas, the pressure to act reached critical levels. By the time their preparations reached the final phase, exhaustion and desperation had pushed everyone to their limits. Eventually, as Ember surveyed their makeshift army of survivors and volunteers, she wondered if love and hope could truly overcome such overwhelming darkness. That night, they would either achieve the impossible or witness the end of magic itself. Come morning, if there was a morning, reality would look completely different. But then, as she felt the combined magical signatures of their allies resonating through the dimensional barriers, she realized they had already achieved something the Void Lord couldn't understand: true unity based on shared purpose rather than domination. Reality bent around them as they launched the most desperate assault in supernatural history. Ember led the charge through dimensional barriers, her combined elemental and Luna magic blazing like a comet as she tore through void defenses that had stood for millennia. Next, Thorne's power merged seamlessly with hers, their purified bond creating pathways through hostile space that allowed their allies to follow where none had gone before. From there, she felt the Void Lord's shock reverberating through dimensions as their unified force struck at the heart of its dimensional anchor. Soon after breaching the entity's primary defenses, the true scope of their enemy's power became terrifyingly clear. What followed was a running battle through landscapes of crystallized despair, where the very ground beneath their feet tried to drain their hope and determination. "Stay together!" she shouted over the otherworldly shrieking of shadow creatures rallying to defend their master. Still, maintaining formation while navigating terrain that actively worked against them required every ounce of concentration she possessed. Yet their unified assault was having an effect. Void rifts throughout their home dimension began destabilizing as the anchor point came under sustained attack. Even so, the Void Lord itself had yet to engage them directly, and she could feel its ancient malice growing stronger as they approached its core position. Despite the progress they were making, casualties mounted with every step forward. On the other hand, each loss only seemed to strengthen their survivors' resolve, transforming grief into fuel for their magical assault. More importantly, the dimensional anchor was revealing structural weaknesses that their combined assault could exploit. In fact, Master Aldrich's theory about void entities requiring stable dimensional foundations was proving accurate under battlefield conditions. Not only that, but their purified love bond was creating interference patterns that disrupted the Void Lord's control over its own realm. What's worse for their enemy, the entity couldn't corrupt what they had already purified through sacrifice and choice. To make their situation even more desperate, time was running out. Their home dimension's protective barriers would fail completely within minutes. Moments later, as alarms echoed across multiple realities, she realized this would be their only chance for victory. By the time they reached the anchor chamber's outer perimeter, half their force had been lost to void corruption or shadow creature attacks. Eventually, as she stared at the massive crystalline structure that held their enemy's power in place, she understood that conventional assault would never be enough. That night would require the ultimate sacrifice, not of life, but of the safety and isolation that had once defined her existence. Come morning, she would either be the queen who saved all realities, or nothing would remain but endless void. But then, as the Void Lord finally revealed itself in all its terrible glory, she felt every lesson about love and unity crystallizing into perfect clarity. Instead of fear, she experienced absolute certainty about what needed to be done. Meanwhile, through their bond, she felt Thorne's complete trust in whatever choice she was about to make. At the same time, surrounded by allies who had risked everything to follow her into the heart of darkness, she realized that some battles could only be won by embracing the very vulnerability that made victory possible. Because love wasn't weakness, it was the strongest force in any reality. Love became a weapon that could rewrite the laws of reality itself. Ember stood at the heart of the Void Lord's dimensional anchor, her elemental magic blazing with Luna starlight as she made the choice that would either save all existence or destroy everything she'd ever loved. Next, she reached for Thorne through their purified bond, drawing on every moment of vulnerability and trust they'd shared to forge something the ancient entity had never encountered, creation born from absolute unity. From there, their combined power began unweaving the crystalline structure that anchored void hunger in their reality. Soon after their assault began in earnest, the Void Lord's true form materialized before them, its alien magnificence both terrible and beautiful, in ways that human consciousness could barely process. What followed was a battle that transcended physical combat. Fought on planes of existence where thought became reality and emotion shaped the fundamental forces of creation. You cannot unmake what was never made. The entity's voice resonated through dimensions as it brought its full power to bear against their unified assault. Still, even as reality buckled around them under the weight of cosmic forces, she felt Thorne's love blazing through their bond like an anchor in the storm. Yet their enemy's greatest strength, its ability to consume magical energy, proved useless against power generated by pure creative love. Even so, the battle pushed them beyond every limit they thought they possessed, demanding sacrifices of endurance and faith that left them spiritually raw. Despite the overwhelming opposition, their love-forged unity began achieving something impossible, healing the wounds the Void Lord had torn in reality's fabric. On the other hand, each moment of progress required them to pour more of themselves into the cosmic working, risking complete dissolution in service of restoration. More importantly, their allies throughout the supernatural realm felt the change and began channeling their own power into the growing network of creative force. In fact, what started as two people choosing love over fear became a dimensional cascade of hope and renewal. Not only that, but the Void Lord's anchor began to crack as creation overwhelmed consumption for the first time in cosmic history. What's worse for the ancient entity, its very nature prevented it from understanding or countering an assault based on selfless love. To make the victory complete, when the anchor finally shattered, the resulting explosion of creative energy didn't destroy the Void Lord. It offered redemption to a being that had forgotten any existence beyond hunger. Moments later, as cosmic forces rebalanced themselves, she felt the entity's alien consciousness touch theirs with something approaching wonder. By the time the dimensional storms calmed, reality had been fundamentally transformed. Eventually, as she and Thorne found themselves back in their restored throne chamber, she realized they weren't the same people who had begun this journey. That night, the supernatural realm celebrated the return of balance and the birth of a new age where love and unity would guide magical evolution. Come morning, they would begin building a better world on the foundation of what they'd learned about the power of absolute trust. But then, as she looked into Thorne's eyes and saw their shared experiences reflected there, rather she understood that their greatest victory wasn't saving reality. It was discovering that love could transform any darkness into light. Peace felt strange after so much chaos, but Ember embraced it with grateful hands. She moved through the palace gardens, her healing magic flowing into wounded soldiers and traumatized civilians, with the gentle precision she'd once only dreamed of achieving. Next, she knelt beside a child who'd lost her parents to void creatures, using her enhanced empathic abilities to ease grief that threatened to consume such a young soul. From there, she worked her way through the makeshift infirmary, marveling at how her elemental power now brought comfort instead of destruction. Soon after the major healing work was completed, she found herself standing in the memorial grove where they'd planted trees for every life lost during the crisis. What followed was a quiet ceremony where survivors shared stories of the fallen, celebrating lives that had been cut short but not forgotten. They didn't die for nothing. Thorne's voice was soft as he joined her among the saplings that would grow into a living testament to sacrifice and courage. Still, she could feel his own grief through their bond, the weight of leadership that demanded impossible choices from those who cared most deeply. Yet even in mourning, there was hope. Even so, the process of rebuilding would take years, and many scars would never fully heal. Despite the magnitude of the work ahead, she felt more optimistic than she'd ever been. On the other hand, seeing how supernatural communities were choosing cooperation over ancient rivalries suggested that perhaps their victory had changed more than just the cosmic balance. More importantly, the young survivors were already showing signs of new magical abilities. Hybrid powers that combined different traditions in ways that would have been impossible before the dimensional barriers were healed. In fact, the next generation would grow up in a world where unity was strength rather than vulnerability. Not only that, but her own transformation from frightened hermit to confident queen served as inspiration for others who'd struggled with feeling different or dangerous. What's better? She'd learned that accepting help didn't make her weak. It made her complete. To make the recovery even more promising, former enemies were working together to establish new magical academies where young people could learn to control their abilities without fear or shame. Moments later, when a group of children approached to ask if she'd teach them about elemental magic, her heart swelled with purpose. By the time the sun set over their restored realm, she understood that healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken, it was about building something better than what had existed before. The Coronation Grove glowed with living magic as reality itself bore witness to love's triumph. Ember stood beside Thorne beneath the canopy of trees they'd grown with their combined power, wearing a crown of woven starlight and elemental flame that had manifested from their purified bond. Next, she looked out over the assembled representatives of every supernatural community, former enemies now united by shared purpose and mutual respect. From there, she spoke words of commitment that bound her not just to Thorne but to every being who called this realm home. Soon after the formal vows were exchanged, the Luna's throne, now transformed into a living crystal tree, pulsed with energy that strengthened every magical being present. What followed was a celebration that lasted 3 days and nights, marking not just their union, but the birth of a new age where cooperation would replace conquest. "I never imagined this," she whispered to Thorne during a quiet moment between festivities, gesturing toward the children playing games that mixed different magical traditions without conflict. Still, even as joy filled her heart, she remained aware of the responsibilities that came with their enhanced abilities. Yet watching young supernatural beings create art with magic that combined previously incompatible traditions filled her with confidence about the future they were building. Even so, she knew that maintaining this peace would require constant vigilance and continued growth. Despite the celebration's joy, they both understood that their real work was just beginning. On the other hand, having proven that love could overcome cosmic entropy, earthly challenges seemed manageable by comparison. More importantly, their bond had evolved beyond simple romantic partnership into something that enhanced both their individual strengths and their shared purpose. In fact, ruling together felt as natural as breathing, each complementing the other's abilities with intuitive precision. Not only that, but the magical academies they'd established were already producing graduates who saw unity as strength rather than weakness. What's better, the hybrid abilities emerging in the next generation suggested that their victory had created lasting change at the deepest levels of magical reality. To make their success complete, reports from across the dimensional barriers indicated that their example was inspiring similar cooperation in other realities. Moments later, when ambassadors from neighboring dimensions arrived to establish formal diplomatic relations, she realized their love story had become legend. By the time they retired to their private chambers, a sanctuary carved from living crystal and growing wood that reflected their merged natures, she felt complete in ways she'd never imagined possible. Eventually, as they settled by their fireplace with elemental flames dancing in perfect harmony with Luna starlight, she spoke the truth that had guided them through every challenge. That night, as she fell asleep in Thorne's arms with their bond humming contentedly between them, she knew that whatever the future brought, they would face it together. Come morning, they would continue building a world where love was the strongest magic of all.